Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are located today. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse. I'm Lindsay Velocino with Scrum.org. I will be your moderator today. And today we have professional Scrum Trainer Ben Day here, and he is going to be presenting how to fix a failing project. So lots of great stuff to cover here today, and we hope you enjoy it and have lots of questions to ask Ben as well. So next slide, please, Ben.
Okay.
Just some very quick guidelines here. So you'll notice that your microphone is muted. That is okay. That is on purpose. We are going to be collecting questions, though, through the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions for Ben, please put those in throughout the session, and we will ask those and have some Q&A time during this session. And any questions we don't get to, we're going to be sharing with Ben as well. So keep that in mind. And the session is also being recorded, and that will be available within 24 hours. You will get an email with a link to that recording. The recording will also be on the Scrum.org website. So next slide, please. Very quickly, just a little bit about Scrum.org. We are the home of Scrum. We were founded by Ken Schwaber in 2009. And we offer training, certification, and ongoing learning for professional Scrum. You will notice on our website, we have a lot of free learning resources to continue your learning, like this webinar and other things as well. So please feel free to check those out. And with that, I'd like to pass this over to Ben to introduce himself and kick off the content.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks very much. All right, where do I start? Well, I'm Benjamin Day, owner of Benjamin Day Consulting, based out of Brookline, Massachusetts, which is basically Boston. I'm a consultant and trainer. I've been a Scrum.org PST since, almost literally the very beginning. I helped co-teach the first course that we ever did a zillion years ago. Man, I'm old. I like to think of myself as a rental chief technology officer who can still write code, therapist for teams. I obviously do Scrum, Azure DevOps, Azure, all kinds of software stuff. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a Pluralsight author, Scrum.org trainer, like I said before. You can heckle me on Twitter. My website is www.benday.com. And yeah, anyway, if there are questions that we don't get to, or you think of something later, feel free to email me, benday@benday.com. A little bit of shameless plug stuff on Pluralsight. If you're into Scrum, if you're into Azure DevOps and you want to try to do both at the same time, I just have a new course, Implementing Scrum with Azure DevOps. I've got Azure DevOps Fundamentals course, and then a bunch of Scrum Master Skills stuff. So go look at that if you want to. You don't have to. Also, if you're a Azure DevOps user, I've got a bunch of free utilities. So Azure DevOps Util. And one of the things that I am going to get to at the end of this session is talking about forecasting using throughput and cycle time flow metrics. And I have a bunch of utilities that come with that Azure DevOps Util that will help you do that. Just connects to Azure DevOps and outputs. Well, it basically predicts the future for you. Got some other stuff, so go check out my blog. I've got all kinds of free stuff that you can play with. Anyway, on with the show. So thinking about projects that I've worked on in the past, you know that feeling, something's not right. You've got a failing project, or it's a troubled project, or it's an at-risk project that someone really cares about, and people are worried. They really care about this stuff. And this is one of the things that I've done a lot in my career, is helping organizations take projects that are kind of in trouble and driving that particular bus out of the ditch. So I think that it breaks down into two types of failures, sometimes both at the same time. One would be technical problems and implementation problems, and the other one would be people and expectation management problems, which I oftentimes would think of as project management problems. I'm going to focus on the second one today. The first one is super technical. If you're interested in talking about those kind of things, drop me a line, but I'm going to focus on the project management stuff. Now, some of the symptoms and the causes of of these troubled projects, things you might notice would be nothing is getting done, or you've got buggy or low quality software that's going out the door, or you've got really unhappy stakeholders, like people that are just grumpy at you all the time. Maybe you've got wobbly requirements. People are asking questions about when it's going to be done, and you have absolutely no idea, or you have no data to back up when something's going to be done. This starts to turn into perception problems, perception that the project is in trouble, and starts to brew trust problems that the team or you don't know what you're doing. Credibility problems pop up. And a lot of times what happens is that this perception of a troubled project becomes a reality of a troubled project. You kind of manage the project to death. So yeah, not great. And at its core, you've got someone who really thinks that their needs aren't going to be met. And at the core of that is fear. They're afraid that you are not going to be able to meet their needs. So the answer on this is address the fear. So if they're afraid of something, acknowledge that that fear exists, confirm that it maybe is even reasonable for them to think that. So step one, start to address that human side. Now, there's an actual framework for how you think about needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And a lot of times you would think of this in psychiatry and psychology, and things you might talk about in therapy with your therapist or something. But in reality, this is very helpful even at work. Now, I'm not going to talk through it right now, a little out of scope, but just know that it's there. There are frameworks for how you think about people's needs and how you address them. So first thing that I would like to have you think about is changing the way you talk about what's happening on your projects. So reinvent your project with new words. Now, how we talk is how we think, which turns into the yeah, duh phrase, words matter. Of course, words matter. But a lot of times we think that just because we work in software, that it's about computers and it's easy and whatever. The words, the human stuff doesn't really matter, but it does. It matters a ton. So when you're trying to fix a project that maybe is in trouble, talk about what you're going to do rather than what you're going to stop doing. Subtle little thing here. What you're trying to do is you're trying to create motion. You're going to communicate with motion. Motion going forward, not motion going backwards. You're going to try to lead out of your problems. So you're going to try to create motion away from the problems towards some kind of solution, or at least in a direction of something that's better. Now, a lot of us, especially when we get nervous or we're working with people that are grumpy about stuff, we tend to start thinking about, we say things that just aren't great. One, we assume blame that maybe isn't ours to assume. And this puts teams, delivery teams, in this really reactive spot where they need to, they kind of get defensive about what's going on. I don't really want you to do that. I want you to establish yourselves, establish the development team as being equals to the people that are the stakeholders for this thing. But anyway, a lot of times what we'll run into is we'll start using some phrases that I think just aren't really super great. You'll say something like, "Oh, we're gonna work extra hard to get this going," which usually means we're gonna work nights and weekends and we're never gonna have a life. That doesn't scale. That's not great. We're reviewing your requirements to make sure we don't miss anything. All right, great. It's kind of a platitude. Yeah, sure, we're going to pay attention to you now. Once again, doesn't really tell you much of what we're going to do. Or my favorite, we're going to stop missing our promised delivery dates. It's like, cool. Well, that's great. Why didn't you do that before? I don't know. Don't worry about it. We're going to work on quality. So we're going to make it stop stinking really bad. We're going to get better. Yeah. Okay. How? We're going to get you something soon. So these are all things we probably have all said in project management land, and they're not awesome. So here are some phrases that are better. 1 of 4. We're going to focus on what done really means, and we're going to start delivering smaller chunks of tangible, usable, done functionality every couple of days. So this is actually saying what we're going to do and why we're going to do it. We're going to focus on what done means. We're going to drive delivery about how we're doing, how we're working on features. We're going to drive it to done every couple of days. We're going to try to deliver to you on a regular basis. Another phrase, we're going to work with the business to ensure that feature priorities match the priorities of the business. Okay, this says we're going to give you what we want. Excuse me, we're going to give you what you want, and we're going to do it by working with you to make sure that what we're working on aligns with what you need. So once again, this is something leading forward. Or number 3, we're going to focus on quality earlier in our process. For example, we're going to start involving our QA testers during sprint planning, and then we're going to embed them with the developers during the sprint. So this is saying something we're actually going to do. So we're going to improve our quality. Great. If you say that just by itself, without saying something about how you're going to do that, a lot of times, well, management people tend to just not believe you. They're like, okay, cool. That's never going to happen. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to actually talk about what we're doing. We're going to involve QA testers in some new way that we weren't before. Phrase number 4 of 4, our goal is to get stakeholder feedback sooner and more often. We're going to try to make an investment in DevOps and automation so we can deliver faster, more reliably, and more often. So we're starting off by saying what our goal is. Our goal is to get feedback from our stakeholders sooner and more often. This also has a side effect of we're going to try to deliver things to you sooner and more often. We're going to give you something that's usable. And then we're going to do that. We're going to make it happen by doing X, Y, and Z. So what we're doing is that we are actually providing some kind of forward momentum and forward description of what we're going to actually do, as opposed to what we're going to stop doing. All right, so let's think of some other stuff. So steps to fix it. So changing the mindset. Now, you're in a hole, stop digging, right? You've probably heard this before. Don't make the problem worse. So some things that I would think that we'd want to do, and this is my master list, and we'll drill into these individually. Consider killing the project. Acknowledge you have credibility problems and stop making promises about dates. Define what done means. Figure out your priorities for the next 2 to 4 sprints. Really work to minimize work in progress. And then potentially change how you predict the future using flow metrics. All right, so step 1A, consider killing the projects. Okay, it's not going well. You've got unhappy customers. You're not getting anything done. People think what you're building is garbage. Maybe you should just lean into that and consider that this is, well, we should just stop doing it. Kill the project. Or occasionally, the answer is you just quit your job and find another job. We're sort of taught, I'm American, we're kind of taught in America that, you never quit. Well, come on, let's not be obsessive about that. Sometimes quitting is the right thing to do, especially if it's killing the project. Maybe the value of the project is not obvious anymore, or it's just so late that you're never going to be able to recoup the cost, and it's time to stop digging. Consider that the project is not worth saving. So keep in mind, this is step 1A, part of a conversation that I would be having with stakeholders, customers, management. So step 2, or step 1B, confirm that it's worth continuing. So if you made it through that first part, and they're like, yeah, we still want this. Well, confirm that it's still worth continuing. This is kind of that ultimate power move, because no one really expects you to come in and say, well, it's in trouble. Maybe we just kill the project. They want you to apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry that it's late. It's my fault. I'll do whatever. I'll move heaven and earth to make sure this thing is awesome. And that's probably not realistic, right? So coming into this thing and trying to reframe and reconfirm that what you're doing is worth doing gets people thinking about that. It gets them, it starts enlisting stakeholders and managers and executives in revalidating that it is worth doing. Why do you want this thing? And then probably ask the question, how will you know if it's successful? So if we have managed to steer this particular project out of the ditch, how will we know if it's successful? And then one of the other things that I think oftentimes is a really fun question to ask when you're in this, it kind of lightens the mood, is how will you know if it's failed? Or how can we find, what are the creative ways that we could potentially absolutely destroy this project? If we wanted to keep digging and make this thing worse, what would we do? How will we know if those things are happening? How will we know if we're succeeding at really tanking this project? So it gets people to start brainstorming the positives and the negatives of what we're going to do in this project going forward. I would also ask, what are your top priority features? Now, if you're working with CTOs, CEOs, they always say, well, everything is my top priority feature. And you're like, okay, cool. Yeah, right. But if you really only could just do one or two, what would you do? And it's worth it to really push on these things. So what are the top priority items? And this really will help you to focus on what's important. Why are we doing this? And what should we be doing first in order to make our stakeholders, our executives, our managers happy? Because, well, if the project is sort of in this failure mode, they're not happy, probably because they're not getting the stuff that they want. So if you start working on delivering the stuff that they really want, well, you probably start making them happy. Step number 2, and I know I just said a second ago, choose words with motion and talk about what you're going to do as opposed to what you're going to stop doing. And I know I'm instantaneously violating that. So stop making promises on dates. So when am I going to get my stuff? Everyone wants to know, when am I going to get my stuff? Now, on the flip side of that is that nothing makes customers more nervous than when you keep making promises on dates and you keep missing those dates. So what I would say, and this goes into the if you're in a hole, stop digging scenario, is stop making those promises on dates. Stop predicting things that you don't know for sure you can't make happen, because they think you don't know what you're doing, and they're probably not wrong about that. You're making predictions on dates and you miss them every single time, and it just makes your credibility problems even worse. So just stop. So don't make promises you can't keep, and you're going to need better data in order to start predicting these things, and that's what I'm going to talk about at the very end of this talk. So why are dates slipping? Put another way, why are your estimates wrong? Well, software is hard. There's complexity, there's unknowns, there's dependencies, there's wishful thinking that happens. Oh, this time we're going to make it awesome. Well, yeah, there's all kinds of these things happen, and well, the dates slip. Especially try not to make promises about dates. You can make forecasts about when things might actually show up, but don't promise things. Now, there's a dirty little secret in software development. Your customers don't really care about your estimates. They really don't. They're like, when do you think it's going to be done? And you say X, Y, Z. They don't really care about that. They just want their done working software. So they ask for it in a really weird way. They ask for, when's it going to be done? You give them a date, you miss the date, and then they don't get their stuff, and then they're disappointed. And they think that you don't know what you're doing. So you're going to try to flip that around. Your customers want their done working software. So let's start, well, making them happy by giving them something that's actually done. Now, what we're going to do with this is we're going to start training our stakeholders, our customers, our managers, our executives to know that they're going to get a reward on a regular basis. So I'm guessing, since this is a Scrum.org webinar here, that y'all probably work in Scrum, you probably work in a series of sprints. And well, at the end of every sprint, we want to deliver done working software, some little bit of something that's done. Now, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to make sure that we absolutely deliver something to done on the end of every sprint. And ideally, we're going to deliver something to done even before the end of the sprint. If you can deliver something to done every couple of days, you're going to start training your customers, your stakeholders, your executives, that they're going to start getting things on a regular basis. And one of the biggest problems we run into on troubled projects is that these chunks of done are not happening very often, or they come in like big bang chunks every couple of months. And that just makes people nervous. So the first thing that we need to start making sure we know if we're going to try to deliver done is, well, what does done actually mean? So first off, create a definition of done. Now you might be thinking, yeah, we all know exactly what done means. And I'm going to throw out the idea to you that perhaps, just perhaps, you don't actually know what done means as well as you think you do. So definition of done is everything that it takes to call a requirement done. So 100% done, potentially shippable, no additional work required. And what you're going to do is you're going to work with your team and you're going to write this down. Write down all the things that define what done mean for you and your team. And you're going to discuss it regularly. At a minimum, you're going to discuss what your definition of done is and whether it's still up to date, probably at every sprint retrospective meeting. So last event that happens in Scrum, end of the sprint, you discuss what went well, what didn't go so well, what you want to improve for next time. And part of that is going to be discussing, is our definition of done up to date? Is it good enough? Are there more things we need to think about? So discuss that definition of done regularly and write it down and consider sharing it with your bosses, customers, and stakeholders. Now, there are going to be real technical things probably on that, and those people might not fully understand what those things mean, but there is something to be said for they just see it and they know, okay, you have written these things down. It gives them a sense of comfort to know that at least you know what done actually means. So share it with them, even if they don't understand it, but they might actually understand it and they might have suggestions on things that could go on there. So come up with a definition of done. Now, there's a lot more to your definition of done than the code compiles and it checks in. I'm not going to go through this because I don't have endless amounts of time, but here's a sample definition of done that I use with my customers to get them going when they don't have one. So we start off on the left-hand side with a whole bunch of things that developers and coders care about, unit tests, database upgrade scripts, all that kind of fun stuff, code reviews. And then that's usually where development teams stop. They think, oh, done means this. We're talking about what the developers do. But no, there's a lot of stuff that happens further on, like QA testing, deployment, operations, feedback from product owners. All these things are also part of your definition of done. All the things you have to do in order to make something potentially shippable. So it's going to be a lot, and it's probably going to be a little scary at the beginning. But definition of done touches absolutely everything. So it affects whether your estimates are good. It affects what your forecasts are for when things are going to show up. It helps you to think about work in progress, team communication, communication with stakeholders, QA testing, and how you even think about the problem of quality and managing quality as you deliver. It helps you with DevOps and what you're going to script out and what you're going to ignore and what you have to worry about and what you're going to monitor. And then it definitely helps you with version control, branching, and merging. I say this to my customers and at conference talks all the time, but there is really nothing closer in Scrum to a magical silver bullet than a written definition of done. Defining done can help so many things because it turns into transparency. The team creates its definition of done, and now they know what it means when something is done. And you don't have that problem of, is it done or done? And the difference between done and done is usually a lot of work. Done means it's not done. Done means it really is done. But we want to get away from that. We want to get into this thing where it's either done or it's not done. Now, not only does this help the team to understand when something is done, it helps them to understand when something is not done. And the dirty little secret of this is that most of the time it isn't done. Any feature that you're working on probably spends all of its time, like 99% of its time, not being done. It's not almost done. It's just not done. So don't think about almost. Think about, is it done or not? And then you can share this with your stakeholders, and then they will understand potentially what it means when you talk about done. All right. So most of the time, it's not done. And if you ship things that aren't 100% done, your customers think that you're shipping garbage, and they really don't understand the difference between partially done and done. When you're shipping things that are not fully done, it creates just endless amounts of credibility problems. And it makes communication about the status of your project really hard. And if you flip over to a mindset of it's done or it's not done, that makes it a lot easier, because you don't have to think about, well, 80% done. No, because 80% done is never right. It's either done or it's not done. So start thinking about that. Next thing, step 4, fix your product backlog. So this is another way of saying prioritize your work and make it clear what your priorities are. Now, one of the things, like sort of review about what product backlog is all about. It's your list of requirements, and it represents the vision of everything that might ever be delivered as a feature on this product. Now, you say product backlog item, feature, requirement, user story, whatever you call them, it's basically all about the same thing. This product backlog is a list of everything that you're dreaming of ever doing in this product. One of the biggest problems that I see with teams is, especially on teams that are in trouble, is that they have not enough backlog. So not enough backlog, meaning that maybe they've got some stuff, but it's not really clear what's actually happening on that. So it's unclear what the definition of the product is and what the product isn't. And then it's not really clear when a requirement is actually ready to start being executed on. So they don't have enough of the product backlog for anyone to be able to make any kind of meaningful forecasts about when something's going to show up, or what the priorities are. You want to have 2 to 4 sprints worth of known product backlog. It doesn't have to be perfect. The priorities might change, but 2 to 4 sprints is a lot of stuff. And it starts to give you something to communicate with your stakeholders about. You can show what your priorities are, and you can start asking and answering questions about what those priorities are and what their priorities are. Another mistake that I see a lot with product backlogs is that you have requirements, PBIs, that only make sense to the technical people. Now, we oftentimes call PBIs user stories. Well, they call it a user story because it's supposed to tell some kind of story. It's not supposed to be just some kind of like, oh, we need to implement this store procedure and then implement this service endpoint. Now, that might be what you end up doing, but you want your product backlog items to tell some kind of story about what you're trying to do. So if your PBIs are not readable by mere mortals, maybe they're very tasky PBIs, it makes it very hard to communicate with your customers about what the priorities are and to validate that what you're working on is the right stuff, that it's what they want, or that the way that you're thinking about those product backlog items is something that makes sense to them. So you want to be very clear with your customers about what you're working on and why you're working on it. Now, a very common scenario that I see is we all have someone who looks like this. Usually this is our most difficult and annoying stakeholder. And this person comes to you and says, oh, what are you working on? And there's definitely a bad way to answer this question. A bad way to answer this question is, I have no idea. So you don't really know what the priorities are. You're not real clear what the priorities are. You can't tell a story about what you're trying to work on. And this person immediately goes away thinking you don't know what you're doing, and that we're never going to get our stuff done, and this project is a disaster. Or another one, this guy comes and asks the same question, what are you working on? And then you say, blah, 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 SQL Server, reactive, we're going to do upgrade to Azure 14, blah, 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 stuff. They have no idea what you just said. It's a bunch of technology gobbledygook. And they immediately are like, oh yeah, you're trying to BS me on this. You're in trouble. This project is a disaster. I'm going to go complain to your boss and make your life a living hell, right? That's exactly what happens. When you have a stakeholder who is afraid they're not going to get their stuff, they generally are going to go to your boss and start saying to your boss that you don't know what you're doing. And that doesn't usually help you out. What you want to be able to do is you want this person to come to you and say, oh, what are you working on? And you want to be able to do something like this. You want to say this thing right here, point to what you're working on. You open up your product backlog, you point to it, and they know exactly what you are working on and why. They also can look at this thing and see what's coming up next. Now, one of the things that happens with stakeholders a lot is they kind of change their mind, or they suddenly start thinking about, one particular feature they care about. I got to have marked transaction for fraud audit. We got to have that right away. And they just complain to you about that thing. And they're like, when are we going to get to it? And you say, okay, well, it's right here. It's the 7th item on our backlog. So we'll get to it, maybe next sprint or the sprint after. You give them hopefully give them something a little bit more precise than what I just said, but you can at least point to it in your product backlog and say, oh yeah, it's right here. That's where it is. It's in this list of priorities. And if it's really important to this person and they say, we need it now, you can start saying, okay, well, what would you bump in order to get that sooner? And if your product backlog is well fleshed out like this, it's got things that are readable and reasonably understandable to non-technical users, a lot of times you can start to convince them that perhaps the priorities make sense the way they are. Or you at least enlist them in what you would bump in order to get them that thing sooner. Now, one of the other things that I think about a lot with my product backlog items being telling a story and being readable by non-technical people is I don't want to waste my time talking about what we're trying to do or what something means. I just want it to be understandable to them. So I'm not spending a lot of time translating a bunch of technology stuff to them, right? The more time that you can spend discussing things with them, the better. The more that you have to spend explaining stuff, then the harder your job actually is. So your product backlog is your vision for the future of the product. Backlog refinement is unbelievably important. You need to make sure you're going over it with your team, making sure that you are setting clear priorities, even if those priorities are perhaps wrong. They might be wrong, but write them down and try to get feedback on your priorities. And try to have 2 to 4 sprints worth of really well understood backlog. And this is to say, what are we going to do for the next 2 to 4 sprints? Have it be there and have it be readable by humans so that when they ask, what are you working on? And when am I going to get my stuff? You can answer that question. All right, moving on. Step number 5 for saving a project, minimize work in project. Excuse me. Let me just take a quick sip of water. Minimize work in progress. So do less at once in order to do more overall. Now, if any of you have ever seen me talk at a conference or teach a class, you've probably seen me plugging this graph right here. But if you haven't seen it, this is the thing that sends chills through executives' souls. So there's this book, Quality Software Management, Volume 1, System Thinking by Gerald Weinberg. And on page 284 of just a barn burner of a book, he lays out a bunch of information about productivity and waste. So he went and followed a bunch of developers and said, okay, well, let's try to figure out how productive they are if they're working on 1 task, 2, 3, 4, or 5 tasks simultaneously. So if they're working on 1 task at a time, then they're 100% productive on that task. Makes sense, right? Minimal distractions. If they're trying to do 2 things at once, they could spend 40% on each of those tasks and 20% waste. That's not great. 3 simultaneous tasks, 20% on each of those tasks and 40% waste. 4 simultaneous tasks, they could spend 10% of their time on each of those tasks, 60% waste. Now, how much you want to bet that when I go to 5 simultaneous tasks, it doesn't suddenly get a whole lot better? Because it doesn't. 5 simultaneous tasks, he's finding that you can spend 5% of your time on each of those, and 75% of your time just gets lost, just disappears. It's waste. Context switching just blows it away. So if you think about what 75% of a typical work week means, that would be like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and half of Thursday just gone. And you get to work about half of Thursday and Friday. And that's basically the effect. It would be like not coming in for 3.5 days if you're trying to work on 5 simultaneous tasks. Yeah, terrifying. So what we want to do is we really want to try to get our teams to be working on fewer things at a time. Like, let's say right now that your team is working on 5 simultaneous tasks. That implies 75% waste. If you could get them down to 3 simultaneous tasks instead of 5, they're just working on 2 fewer things at one time. That implies that you will get a 35% performance boost out of your team just by crafting a different path through what you're working on. Yeah, that's scary. So let's think about how this might show up on your development team. So you might be using a Scrum board back at the office to track the work in progress. And you've got a column that says product backlog items. So you're working on PBI A, B, and C. And then for each of those PBIs, you've got a set of tasks. The tasks are the list of things the team has to do to make that PBI done. And on your Scrum board for the sprint, you can very quickly see what the status of each of those PBIs is. So PBI A, B, and C are all completely in the to-do column. We don't have anything done yet. So what you're going to be doing as you work is you're going to be moving the tasks that are in progress gradually over into the done column, and hopefully all those PBIs get to done. But the real danger that you run into, I see this again and again and again, and I don't know why this makes so much sense to teams that they want to work this way, but here's the Scrum board danger I see all the time. So you've got 3 PBIs inside your sprint, and on day number 1, everyone takes a PBI and it goes to in progress. And what we're trying to do is we've got 3 things in progress right now. And what we're hoping for is that we eventually drive that all to done. So that's super, super dangerous because there's too much work in progress. So work in progress is commonly abbreviated as WIP, W-I-P. And well, here's another way that this typically looks if you're looking at your Scrum board. So day number 1 of 15. So you do sprint planning, and then day number 2, everyone picks a PBI up and they start working on it, and they're working on it and working on it and working on it and working on it. And what you're really hoping for is that, once you get towards the end of the sprint, things start to get to done and everything's happy and wonderful. And then in an ideal world, you get to day number 14 of 15, and in your dreams, suddenly everything goes to done and everything's happy, 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 right? This is what we want to have happen. But what happens more realistically is this. You get to the end, and then you kind of discover a bunch of integration work, and there's some stuff that we missed. And we have more things we have to do, and there's just plenty that has to happen. We didn't get anything done, and everyone's grumpy. So what went wrong? Too much work in progress, not enough done. Because most of the sprint, it looked like this. We had 0 items done. So a better approach to work in progress is this. So do less at once to get more done overall. So take that first PBI, and the entire team swarms on it. We only try on the team to work on one thing at a time. And then at the end, after we finish swarming on it, we make the whole thing done and we're happy. Now, we just keep going on that. Next, we go to the PBI B, the next highest priority item, drive it to done. Next one, drive it to done. Now, what we're doing has a huge benefit for managing risk. Biggest risk we've got in Scrum is that we deliver nothing at the end of the sprint. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to focus on delivering things to done sooner. So let's say that we're working this way. And on day number 5 of 15, we've got this PBI A is completed, and then everything's a disaster. From that point on, it's just the rest of the sprint, nothing goes right. The server room's on fire. Someone wins the lottery and doesn't come into work anymore. No one can find the the password for Azure or the password for Amazon, it's just a disaster. Everything's just bad. But buried in here is a little bit of good news. And the good news is that you have one thing done. So at least one thing got completed by working this way. Day 5 through 15 was an absolute flaming disaster, but at least you got one thing done. If you work that other way, where the entire team brought PBI A, B, and C into progress on the first day, and day number 5 happens, you didn't get anything done at all in that sprint because you had, well, too much work in progress. So do less at once, and that gets to a decreased risk of delivering nothing in that sprint. Same pile of work, different way of delivering it, and you should be thinking a lot about this graph right here, trying to minimize the number of things that you and your team are worried about at one time. You will be able to deliver them faster. The faster that you deliver those things, the faster you get feedback on them. The faster you get them to done, the faster you put something done into the hands of your cranky stakeholders or your cranky bosses or your cranky executives. The faster that you can start capturing value or capturing feedback. Now, just to make it really clear, the whole team is going to work on one product backlog item at a time, ideally, or something close to one. But this helps the team to focus. And the team's focus is on the details of a single PBI rather than the details of a bunch of PBIs. Now, you might be thinking, what does this make our daily stand-up look like, our daily Scrum meeting? Well, it's going to be really different. I'm going to guess that your daily Scrum is kind of boring right now, right? Because if everyone's taking a PBI separately, you don't really care what they're working on because you're not working on the same stuff. You're not really working as a team. But if you do it this way, I guarantee that the way that you talk in your daily Scrum meeting is going to be entirely different because everyone is aligned on delivering the same PBI roughly at the same time. All right, step number 6, flow metrics. Predict the future, change the conversation, save the world. So back to this guy. He's asking, when am I going to get my stuff? And well, if you're working with traditional metrics in Scrum, like story points and velocity, yeah, you're probably going to try at that point to start explaining story points and velocity. But have you ever tried to explain to your customer what that stuff actually means? They glaze over so fast. And that's because traditional Scrum and Agile metrics are hard to explain, and they're almost impossible to understand. Teaching what story points mean and explaining what velocity is and how it relates to estimating is probably one of my least favorite things to do as a trainer. I can do it, but it's hard. And my groups always kind of glaze over because it doesn't make intuitive sense to people. So one thing that I say is consider ditching the stuff that doesn't work or that's hard to understand. So story points, estimating, velocity, really hard for people to understand. So maybe don't do it. Now, love him or hate him, I'm not necessarily like a gigantic Ronald Reagan fan, but I went looking for this quote and I found out that it's from his book. If you're explaining, you're losing. Now, another one is like, if you have to explain the joke, then the joke wasn't funny. But if you have to keep explaining what you're doing and why you're doing it, or what it means, you're losing, you're behind because you're not talking about the right stuff. So if you're trying to bring your project out of the ditch, if you want to build rapport with your customers, and you need to build rapport with your customers and regain their trust, you need to have time to talk about things that matter. The things that matter are questions about requirements, feedback on designs, possible approaches, things that we might be doing in the future, things the team has completed. But then there's other stuff that's helpful for building rapport, which is just getting to know your stakeholders as humans. So, asking them questions about their kids or their families, their hobbies, their vacations, things they're proud of, things they're excited about, looking forward to, things you might have in common. The more that you can build this relationship where you're both humans, the better that you're actually going to do. So thinking about story points and velocity, ain't nobody got time to explain story points. They want to talk about things that are important in their lives. And if you have to explain story points to them again and again and again, in order to answer that question about when are they going to get their stuff, that's a really hard place to be in. So you might want to flip over to using some metrics that mere mortals can understand. One of them is throughput. So throughput is a number of items that get done in a particular period of time. And it's really powerful, and you can start predicting the future and start talking about when you're going to get stuff done by using throughput, and it's going to be very easy to explain to non-technical users. My recommendation when you start going with throughput is keep it simple. Think about number of items per week or per 2 weeks. Just keep it at some fairly large thing. If you're trying to figure out what your throughput per hour or per day is, I think that then it's going to be a noisy pile of data. But per 1 week, pretty easy to understand. Now, back at the beginning, I said I had some free utilities for how you can start accessing flow metrics like throughput and cycle time and predicting the future with those things. Here's a blog post where I talk about how to do that stuff and how to use those free utilities with Azure DevOps that will help you to get that information out. Dana Vacanti, also another person in the Scrum.org community, has an absolutely awesome book, Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability. Go buy that, or maybe consider even taking the Professional Scrum with Kanban training course. And those things are going to focus a lot on what those throughput metrics are, and they're going to be a lot easier for you to communicate with your bosses, stakeholders, executives about when stuff is going to show up. So, in summary, start off by considering killing the project. Remember, you have credibility problems, so try to stop making promises about dates. Define what done means. Figure out what your top priority items are for the next 2 to 4 sprints. Really focus on driving things to done and minimize work in progress. And then consider trying to change how you predict the future by using flow metrics. So at that point, let's go to some questions. So Lindsay, how are we doing?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions that have come in, so we will try to get to as many as possible. So let's start here with this question from Anita. Thank you, by the way, for that, Ben. That was really great. So let's say you're a Scrum Master and would like to kill a project, but the team and management disagree. How do you go about that?
Well, if the executives think that that project is still valuable, then maybe you shouldn't kill it. I mean, if you're the Scrum Master, I think that, yeah, you could definitely talk to them about, revalidating why they want it and how they know it'll be successful and how they know it will fail and what their priorities are. And that's like, even if they decide to not kill it, the Scrum Master can be really helpful at making sure that it gets back on progress and develops that focus.
Yep, that is great. Thank you. So this next question from Scott, giving them done features works awesome, but it provides no information about the full feature set. Customers do care about that, and businesses care about that from a financial standpoint, both cost and revenue. So how do we communicate to users and the organization that we're pretty much complete, knowing the scope is changing often based on feedback?
Yeah. Man, that is a really tough question.
It is.
I would say to try to see if you can get yourself some time to get the project back on track. One of the things I'd think about would be making sure you have 2 to 4 sprints worth of ready, well understood product backlog. That describes what your roadmap is for what these things are going to be. But I think that the thing that I would say is to really start trying to focus on delivering done chunks of software and making sure the priorities are right. That's going to buy you some time and maybe buy some trust so that you can, talk about what the greater scope is actually going to be. Like, I get it. Like, executives or big companies especially want to know that the entire scope is going to be delivered. And just between us kids, I don't know that that's something that we really can promise. People want that, but like, if the project's in trouble, you really don't have any data that says that you've been able to deliver even small amounts of stuff. So trying to then take a gigantic pile of stuff and make promises on that, I think that puts you in a really tough situation. So I guess my short answer on that is I really would try to build rapport and make sure your priorities are good first.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this next question from Telma, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Which approach do you propose or advise in order to avoid promising dates to stakeholders without compromising the sense of milestone for both team and the customer? Business is always attached to timelines.
Yeah. This, once again, this is like something that just between us kids, just because they want it doesn't mean that
Right.
you should try to give it to them. Like, they want that. I get it. But you don't have the data to give them honest, like verifiable information about this stuff. You really need to start looking at other ways of answering these questions. And I know I went really fast over throughput and cycle time and flow metrics and predicting the future with that stuff, but that's a really good place to start. And it makes it much easier to communicate when you think things are going to be done, because you're going to be able to start communicating in terms of probability. So what I would say is keep trying to deliver at the end of every sprint, or at least every couple of days. That's the cadence of delivery. The cadence of those milestones, I think that you'd probably start looking at throughput metrics to be able to answer your confidence that you'll be able to hit those milestones. And that it's not great, but at least you're having a much more honest and transparent conversation with them.
Right.
That's backed up by some data.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. This question here, definition of done. How about situations where users add scope or scope creep and won't consider it done until everything is fulfilled versus we followed the definition of done based on the original scope? What is the best approach?
Oh, that actually sounds like it's not a definition of done problem. That sounds like somebody is trying to suggest a new product backlog item. So what I would probably say is, first off, I would say, oh, thank you. That's really good feedback. I think that sounds like we need to split that into its own product backlog item. So we're going to have 2 requirements instead of just 1. So rather than trying to load everything into one PBI, we're going to say, all right, well, we're going to work on this product backlog item the way that we thought about it in the beginning. It doesn't have to ship. If you think it shouldn't ship, talk to the product owner and we'll figure something out. But let's deliver it based on what we know for that first one. And then now we know something else that has to go on there. That's a second product backlog item. We'll prioritize that against the rest of the work we have, and we'll track that and deliver it separately. That's one of those things, like you're trying to move things forward. One of the things I worry about a lot is rework, where someone says that's rework, and then you're basically like trying to turn around and react to something that happened weeks ago. And that usually is a project management disaster. It's always easier to say, oh, that's great. Let's create a new PBI and put that on the backlog. And then you can manage it and everyone can see where it is.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So this next question here, in what format do you recommend to show stakeholders on the priorities of your product backlog?
Can you do that one more time?
Yes. Sorry, my voice is not the best.
No, I was trying to find it on the question list myself, and I multitasked and I didn't pay
No worries.
Bad.
In what format would you recommend using to show stakeholders on the status or priorities of your product backlog?
Well, I'll take the priorities part first. So if you've got 2 to 4 sprints worth of pretty well understood, readable product backlog, that's your priority right there. So if it's in prioritized list, you can say, well, this is what the priorities are. What the status of those priorities are is really coming down to, okay, are the PBIs currently in progress in the current sprint or not? So if they're in the current sprint, then you're working on them and they're potentially going to be deliverable in this sprint. Otherwise, they're for a future sprint, and then they're not done yet. But you can point to where it is in the list of priorities, so you can at least give them a feel for when things are going to show up. Oh,
sorry, I'd gone on mute. I am so sorry. Okay, so
just talking to yourself. That's awesome.
Yes, I was talking to myself, folks. So there are a couple questions that had come in on this particular topic here. So I'm going to try to summarize. So a few folks had said that, their PBIs more often can only be worked on by one person at a time. How do you handle that? Because I know you were talking about how the team works together on one specific PBI.
Yeah. It kind of gets into your backlog refinement process and your sprint planning process. If you break down the PBIs with the mindset this is going to be done by one person, then you're going to, well, break them down in the mindset that it's going to be worked on by one person. Your work is going to tend to get organized that way. But if you have an agreement on your team that we're going to try to deliver these things as a group, so swarm on them and drive them to done together, then you're going to start organizing your work that way. So your PBIs are probably going to end up being a little bigger that way. And yeah, I would say I understand that thought that, oh, it can only be done by one person at a time. I bet if you really worked at it, you could probably find a way to make it doable by multiple people at a time. One, it'll be more fun to work that way because you'll be able to work with your colleagues. But the other one that I think about, let's just say for a second that you try and you can't break it down any smaller. That starts to imply to me that maybe your team size is too big. And maybe you need to split into multiple teams, which feels like its own webinar all by itself, team size. If I didn't answer that question well enough, email me, benday@benday.com. I'd be happy to chat some more.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. So I think we are coming up on our time. There are a bunch of questions we did not get to. I will share those with Ben. We will figure out how to get those addressed. Thank you, everyone, for asking such great questions. If we could just go to the closing slides here, Ben, that would be great. So feel free to check out the learning paths on the Scrum.org website. We have a bunch of free resources as well. Next slide. And stay connected with us through our social media channels, through webinars like this one. We run Scrum Pulse webinars about 2 times a month. We also have Ask a PST sessions that you can come to and bring your questions. So with that, thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for
this awesome presentation. I think everyone got a lot out of it. It seems like the audience is super happy about it in the chat. So we will be in touch, audience, regarding open questions. And do you have any closing remarks, Ben?
That's it. Email me if you have more questions. benday@benday.com. I'm always happy to chat. And yeah, thanks a ton. Thanks very much for having me and listen to me ramble.
Thanks, everyone.
All right,
Bye-bye.